Hey guys, so I want to address something that is really not discussed very much in strength and conditioning, but it's a pretty important concept. And this discussion came about because an athlete said basically that they had heard that you couldn't really improve calf size through strength and conditioning, through like doing things like calf raises, so on and so forth. Now, of course, genetics are going to go a long way in developing how every part of your body works, especially with things like forearms and calves. It tends to be a little bit more apparent what role genetics plays in those. At the same time, you can certainly make any tissue in your body larger through resistance. And so calves are, of course, no exception to that rule. If you ever look at people who work a lot or who do a lot of activities in the mountains, they typically have pretty big calves. Training vertical, whether or not you're going up or down, training vertical is going to grow your calves a lot. Now, why? Obviously, you're getting a lot of volume in, and that volume is going to pay off in terms of size. Now, a lot of times whenever we look at the volume that we had to do in a gym to create size for something like our glutes or our quads or our hamstrings or even our arms, it's a very different volume than what we're going to have to use to develop size for our calves. So hypertrophy volume, even though typically there are some ranges that we can rely upon, they don't always, there's not like a set range. It's not like the number of your hypertrophy, like 8 to 12 or whatever per set, certain number of sets, certain total volume per week. It's not like that always applies to every single body part. And amplitude of lifts is one of the reasons why. So let's look at 3 different examples. In our first example, we have, this is a HD 4K representation of lifting and amplitude. So you guys are gonna like this. In this first example, we see kind of the different phases of a clean. In the second example, we have different phases of a back squat. And then third example, of course, we just have the quick calf raise. So in this first example, our athlete is starting from the floor with the clean. They're coming through to the hang position. And then they're getting into that scoop extension phase. And then they're finishing with the catch, where they receive the barbell on their collarbones. Now, if we look through these 4 phases, we can see that they're starting here from the ground. Through the second phase, they are continuing to move upward. At the peak of their extension, they're at the peak of their amplitude, and then they're coming down into the catch. So we can see that the amplitude of this lift, the size from time 0 of the lift until, let's say time 4 or the 4th phase of the lift is a long amplitude. In the second example, we can see that our athlete is starting standing, and then they're getting to the midpoint of their squat with their hip crease below their patella, and then we can see them coming back to standing again. Here, now, in this second example here, our amplitude from time 1 to time 3 is significantly shorter. And then finally, in our third example, we have the calf raise, which is just a really quick up and down. All right, so our amplitude is the smallest here. Now, we can see, and this isn't meant to be, the amplitude here isn't meant to be proportionate where, okay, well, does that mean that a squat is worth 2/3 of a clean, and therefore I can reduce my clean volume by 1/3? No, not really. What we're trying to show here is that essentially amplitude is going to be somewhat inversely proportionate to volume. All right, so as amplitude increases, therefore our volume, especially volume per set, must decrease. So they're inversely proportionate. There's a greater demand on the central nervous system here than there is here. All right, and so we can get more volume in here and force greater adaptation, especially hypertrophy, than we're able to with the clean. Now, over time, of course, you're going to see differences in tissue size with a clean, because the body isn't a digital system where, oh, I haven't hit that hypertrophy volume and per set or total weekly volume, and therefore I'm not going to get any size. You're mostly going to make central nervous system adaptations, but you're also going to make size adaptations just the same with back squat. There does seem to be sort of a range, a magic range of amplitude where the similar amount of volume works pretty well. A back squat is a little bit different than a front squat, but even curls are a much smaller amplitude lift, and yet they still manage to fall into this the same sort of hypertrophy volume. Even though you can recover from an arm curl much easier than you can from a back squat. And that's due to the systemic demand of a back squat. This is now somewhat different, but in the same conversation is the volume related to deadlift. Now deadlift it has less amplitude than a back squat, and yet it is a total body exercise. And typically, it's because it's such a low technical demand for lifting that people can manage to get much closer to their absolute ceiling of strength with the deadlift. And so typically we will back off of the volume that we work on a deadlift simply because there's some jeopardy involved there. Now, of course, if you're moving the barbell perfect every single time, there's almost no jeopardy, but you guys get the idea. Because you're closer to your absolute maximum of strength, then the volume tends to be a little bit lighter. So this means that on things like calf raises, these very small amplitude lifts, so much smaller, by orders of magnitude smaller than a back squat or a power clean, we have to do a lot more volume. Of course, we manage to do that with a little bit more duration-based efforts rather than, I'm gonna have you do 30 calf raises. That's really boring and you're not gonna really like that. And you're gonna start BSing with the partner next to you, and next thing you know don't know if you're on 20 or 30 or 50. Then it sort of becomes useless. It's much easier to engage with time. So keep this in mind whenever you're seeing volume, and kind of like if you're ever analyzing or looking at some of the volume structures or some of the programming structures that we have, pay attention to this and relate it to amplitude, because your amplitude of lifts is going to have a big impact on not only your per set, but also your total weekly volume.